The bridge of the Eclipse was alive with chaos. Alarms blared, flashing red lights cut through the dim glow of the command console, and the faint hum of the ship's engines vibrated underfoot. Captain Arlen Rhodes stood unmoving in the center of it all, his hands clasped behind his back. His posture was rigid, a calm center in the storm. The rest of the crew moved frantically, their eyes darting between screens, their voices thick with anxiety. "Shields holding at 30%, Captain." Lieutenant Kayla Turov's voice was sharp, her hands flying over the controls in a desperate rhythm. Sweat beaded along her brow. "Redirect all power to the engines," Rhodes ordered, his voice smooth, as though the fate of the Eclipse were no more important than a casual stroll. His dark eyes, usually calm and unreadable, glimmered with something almost amused. A grin tugged at the corner of his lips. "Are you serious?" Turov shot him a look that could have cracked glass. "We'll be sitting ducks with no shields." "Do it," Rhodes repeated, undeterred. His grin only deepened, and for a fleeting second, it seemed as though he wasn't concerned about the enemy at all. In fact, he looked excited. The Eclipse rocked again, a violent shudder that sent some of the crew sprawling to the floor. The bridge windows cracked as the barrage of energy blasts from the Karathar ships hit the hull, but still, Rhodes didn't move. His eyes never left the tactical screen. "Captain," Commander Jareth Voss called, his voice a gravelly undertone of suspicion and concern. Voss was a man of action, a soldier who preferred clear and decisive moves. "We can't keep this up. We're outgunned and outnumbered." "I know," Rhodes said, turning his head slightly, never taking his hands off the console. His voice was like a whisper of wind, unruffled. "But the enemy doesn't know that. Yet." Turov's fingers trembled as she executed the order, rerouting the ship's power. But her glare was fixed firmly on the captain. She had known him for years, trusted him in battles and skirmishes. But this felt different. "Is this your plan, Captain?" she asked, disbelief painting her voice. "We're supposed to sit here and let them destroy us?" Rhodes' grin widened, revealing the barest hint of teeth. "No, Lieutenant. We're going to make them regret ever underestimating us." Before Turov could respond, the ship jolted violently once more. The Karathar were relentless. Rhodes could feel the pounding of their energy weapons reverberating through his bones, but his resolve never wavered. He had faced impossible odds before, this was no different. He had one thing they didn't, the advantage of surprise. "Helm, engage evasive maneuvers. Bring us in closer to their flagship," Rhodes ordered, his voice unwavering. The grin never left. "Captain, are you out of your mind?" Voss snapped, stepping forward, his hands balled into fists at his side. "They'll destroy us in seconds. We need to retreat." "No," Rhodes interrupted. "We stay. You want to win this fight, Commander? Then we need to make them believe we're already dead." The tension in the room thickened. Turov shot a nervous glance at Voss, who hesitated but then nodded grimly, acknowledging that arguing with Rhodes was like trying to swim against the tide. "But, sir," Turov began, but her words faltered as the Eclipse shuddered again, this time with greater force. The ship's shields were nearly gone. The crew, looking at the flashing red warnings, could see that death was inevitable unless they did something drastic. "We stay," Rhodes repeated. "Prepare to fire on my mark. We need to get within range of their flagship. We'll take them by surprise." The tension on the bridge was palpable. Rhodes stood tall, his unwavering confidence like a shield against the growing panic. His grin had shifted from calm assurance to something sharper, more determined, as if he could taste the outcome of this battle. Voss locked eyes with him, his earlier defiance cooling into reluctant respect. The captain was mad, yes, but he had always been mad in the right way. And maybe, just maybe, this was why they had survived the worst humanity had faced for so long. Turov swiped at her forehead, eyes still trained on the control panel. "Ready, Captain." "On my mark," Rhodes whispered. A shriek of metal tore through the air as the Eclipse's hull took another hit, throwing the crew to the ground. But when they looked up, they saw it, the massive silhouette of the Carathar flagship looming just ahead. Its cannons charged, its engines thrumming with anticipation. Rhodes' grin was the last thing they saw before he gave the order. Now. The Eclipse surged forward, plunging into the heart of the enemy fleet, its cloaking system flickering out as it tore through the heart of the storm. The countdown had begun, but no one knew if it was the beginning of the end, or the beginning of something far greater. The Eclipse plunged forward, its engines roaring in defiance of the Carathar onslaught. For a moment, it seemed as if time had slowed, the space between the ship and the enemy flagship expanding and contracting with each shudder of the hull. "Incoming fire, Captain." Lieutenant Turov's voice broke through the tension, her fingers flying over the control panel. "We can't keep dodging like this. Our cloaking system will fail any moment." Captain Arlen Rhodes barely acknowledged her, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. The grin on his face had vanished, replaced by the sharp focus of a man who saw something his crew couldn't yet comprehend. "Redirect auxiliary power to the aft shields, Lieutenant," he said, his voice measured. "And patch me through to engineering. It's time to activate the contingency." Turov blinked in confusion but complied, fingers typing with hurried precision. "Captain, you're going to overstrain the system. The contingency was never meant to be." "It was meant to be," Rhodes interrupted. "And it's our only shot." "Commander Voss," he called, turning his attention briefly to the battle-hardened officer at the tactical station. Voss' face was set in a grim line as he studied the enemy fleet, vast, methodical, and merciless. Yet Rhodes' calm confidence seemed to have an unnerving effect on him. "Yes, Captain?" Voss asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Prepare the missile tubes," Rhodes ordered. "We're going to lure them into the trap." Voss hesitated, glancing at the display. "You want us to fire on the flagship?" "Not yet," Rhodes said, his grin flickering back into place. "We need them close. The closer we get, the stronger our strike will be." He paused, his dark eyes glinting with a strange intensity. "They think we're retreating. They don't realize that we've already won." Turov exchanged a glance with Voss. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of disaster. The captain had always played the odds, but this felt different. His instincts, once unshakable, now felt like a gamble with lives on the line. The ship rocked as another barrage of energy blasts slammed against the hull, sending a jolt through the crew. Rhodes didn't flinch, but the grin disappeared again, replaced by the weight of command. His eyes narrowed. "Hold steady, everyone," he said, his voice low but resolute. "This is it." The crew braced as the Eclipse hurtled toward the heart of the Carathar fleet. The starboard side of the ship was now exposed, the shields weakening with every hit. The ship's engines roared louder, a frantic pulse that vibrated through the bridge. A hollow, oppressive silence fell over the crew as they awaited Rhodes' next move. Turov's fingers hovered over the tactical console, her face pale with apprehension. She had fought in battles before, humanity's desperate struggle against alien forces was nothing new. But this was different. The captain's plan was reckless, verging on insane. Yet his certainty, his faith in something none of them could see, was almost contagious. "Captain," she asked cautiously, "what exactly are we waiting for?" Rhodes didn't look at her as he spoke, his gaze locked onto the tactical display, reading the shifting positions of the Carathar ships like a master strategist. "Patience, Lieutenant," he said softly, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the console. "We're waiting for the right moment. The moment they think they've won." Just then, the first of the Carathar ships, a sleek, menacing warship, dropped out of formation, closing the gap between them and the Eclipse at an alarming rate. It fired, a concentrated beam of plasma that screamed toward them like a guided missile. "Brace for impact," Voss shouted as the beam tore through space. But Rhodes wasn't fazed. "Now, Turov," he barked. Without another word, Turov slammed her hand onto the console, and the Eclipse's entire hull shuddered as the hidden weapons system powered up. The ship's underbelly, concealed beneath layers of reinforced plating, open like a predator's maw, releasing the deadly experimental missiles. Target locked, Turov reported breathlessly. Ready to fire. The seconds felt like hours. The Karathar ship was almost upon them now, closing fast. The crew could see the gleaming black hull of the enemy flagship, its weapons charged, its sensors trained on the eclipse. It was a predator's gaze, cold and calculating, waiting for the final strike. And then it happened. Fire! Rhodes commanded. The eclipse erupted in a roar of power as the missiles launched in rapid succession, streaking through the void like streaks of vengeance. Turov's eyes went wide as she watched them cut through the space between them and the enemy, too fast for the Karathar to react. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, everything seemed to slow. The missiles collided with the Karathar flagship in a violent explosion, a burst of light so intense it burned the very fabric of space. The shockwave reverberated across the fleet, shaking the eclipse like a leaf in a storm. For a moment, all was silent. Then the alarms screamed again, louder this time. "We've lost power to auxiliary systems," Turov shouted, panic creeping into her voice. But Rhodes' expression didn't change. "Stay focused," he said, his voice low but calm. "This fight isn't over." Through the haze of the explosion, the Karathar flagship reeled, but it wasn't done. It was far from done. The crew could see the damage, the burning wreckage of the once pristine ship, but it was already realigning its weapons, preparing for the counterstrike. "Incoming!" Voss shouted. The tension on the bridge was suffocating. The eclipse was battered, but the battle was far from over. And Captain Rhodes? He was already smiling again. The eclipse shuddered as another wave of fire from the Karathar flagship rattled its hull. Sparks flared from the control panels, sending bursts of electric blue light across the bridge. Lieutenant Turov's hands were a blur over the console, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "Shields are down to 15%, she said, her voice strained but steady. "We're barely holding together." Captain Arlen Rhodes stood motionless, his dark eyes reflecting the chaos unfolding before him. The momentary thrill from the missile strike had passed, and now a silent weight settled over him. He'd known the enemy wouldn't fall so easily. The Karathar were no mere opponents, they were relentless. But so was he. "Commander Voss, status report," Rhodes said without taking his eyes off the main screen, where the silhouettes of Karathar ships filled the void. "All missile tubes are offline," Voss replied, his voice clipped. He stood a few paces behind Rhodes, his usually confident demeanor now clouded with frustration. "The blast from the flagship hit us hard. We're low on fuel, too. We won't last long in this engagement." Rhodes nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I didn't expect this to be easy." Turov shot him a look, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You didn't expect it to be easy? Captain, we've got 30 enemy ships closing in on us, and you're telling me we're going to fight our way out of this?" "Exactly," Rhodes replied, turning to face her. "I didn't expect to win by running or hiding. The Karathar don't respect retreat, Lieutenant. They thrive on it." His eyes flickered with something cold and dangerous. "And they underestimate us." Turov shook her head, pressing her palms against the console. "I don't understand how you're so calm right now. Our backup is gone, our weapons are failing, and we're surrounded." "We're not surrounded," Rhodes interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. "We're positioned perfectly. The Karathar are expecting us to flee, to panic. What they don't realize is that they've walked right into our trap." Voss raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly is the trap, Captain?" Rhodes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the massive viewport that stretched across the bridge. The stars outside were no longer the tranquil, distant points of light they had been just hours ago. Now, they were smothered by the black silhouettes of the Karathar fleet, closing in, a vast wall of ships that moved with the precision of a deadly swarm. The ship's hum grew louder as the eclipse shifted slightly, the engines struggling to maintain any semblance of balance. A deep sense of urgency thrummed in the air, and yet, Captain Rhodes remained eerily calm, almost detached. "Voss," he said quietly, "get me a read on their flagship." The commander hesitated but complied, tapping commands into his terminal. The Carathar flagship, a massive structure bristling with weapons, dominated the view. Its shields had absorbed the brunt of the missile barrage, but it was still vulnerable. "For now." "Reading complete," Voss said, his voice low. "It's holding steady, but it's not unscathed. If we hit it now, we might stand a chance." Rhodes turned to Turov. "Lieutenant, prep the hyperdrive. We're going in." Turov froze, confusion clouding her face. "Hyperdrive? Are you out of your mind? If we engage the drive now, we'll tear ourselves apart." "I'm aware of the risks," Rhodes replied. "We don't have the luxury of time. We'll need to be precise. We're going to drop out of hyperspace directly behind their flagship. It'll be so sudden, they won't have time to react." Turov's hands hovered over the console, hesitant. "This is insane, Captain. Even if we do manage to hit them from behind, we won't have enough power to get out of the system. They'll rip us to shreds before we can jump again." Rhodes leaned over her station, placing a hand on the console as if grounding himself in the pulse of the ship. "That's why we'll use the last of our fuel to power the jump drive. The Eclipse won't survive the second phase of the plan, but you will. You and the rest of the crew will make it out." Turov blinked, disbelief flashing in her eyes. "What do you mean, we'll make it out?" "That's the final part of the trap," Rhodes said, his voice calm, as though explaining a simple tactical maneuver. "We're not going to defeat the entire fleet. But we are going to destroy their flagship. Once it's gone, their forces will scatter. They'll lose their cohesion, and the rest of the fleet will fall apart." "How can you be sure?" Voss asked, his skepticism clear. "We've seen how resilient they are. We saw it when their ship absorbed our missile strike. They're not just going to scatter because we take down one ship." "They're not human," Rhodes said, his voice colder now. "They don't have the same instinct for survival. The Carathar are a force of pure calculation, and without their flagship, they'll lose their purpose. That's where we'll strike." The entire bridge fell silent. No one spoke for a long moment. It was a dangerous gamble, one that could destroy them all. But in Rhodes' eyes, there was only certainty. "Prepare the jump drive," he ordered. "And don't look back." Turov's hands trembled as she began entering the commands, but her resolve solidified with every passing second. She had always trusted the captain, even when his decisions defied logic. Something about him, something in his demeanor, made her believe that this was the right choice. "Engines primed, Captain," she said, her voice low. Rhodes looked up one last time, meeting the eyes of each crew member on the bridge. "This is our moment," he said, almost to himself. "We do this together." The crew braced, and the countdown began. The Eclipse shuddered once more, and this time, it wasn't just a shake. The entire ship felt as though it were being torn apart. Lights flickered. The hum of the engines strained against the pressure. The countdown to the hyperdrive jump was nearing its end, and Arlen Rhodes felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "Engines at full power, Captain." Turov's voice rang through the bridge, tense and strained. "Good. Initiate jump sequence now," Rhodes ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. There was no room for hesitation. No time for second-guessing. The Carathar flagship loomed in the distance, and if they were going to make it out alive, this would be their only chance. Turov's fingers flew over the console, activating the drive. Engaging in 3, 2, 1. The universe around them seemed to crack open as the Eclipse shot forward, breaking the barrier between real space and hyperspace. The stars blurred into streaks of light, bending with the force of the jump, but it wasn't just the sensation of speed that rocked the crew. It was the knowledge that the Eclipse, their home, their last hope, might not survive this. In a mere instant, they arrived, dropping out of hyperspace right behind the Carathar flagship. The vast, imposing silhouette of the alien ship filled the viewport, its weaponry locked and ready. It was just as they had planned, the surprise attack that would give them the upper hand. But it wasn't enough. A volley of energy blasts erupted from the Carathar ship's rear, slamming into the Eclipse before they even had a chance to respond. The bridge lights flickered, then went out completely. A brief, deafening silence filled the air before the backup systems kicked in, bathing the room in dim emergency lighting. Turov cursed, scrambling to bring the ship's systems back online. "We've lost forward shields. Hull integrity is at critical levels." "We don't need shields, Lieutenant," Rhodes said, his voice eerily calm despite the situation. "Take us in closer. We're not done yet." Voss, who had been monitoring the external sensors, spoke up. "Captain, the flagship's shields are weakening. They're focused on us now. If we push forward, we'll have a shot at their main reactor. One hit there, and they're finished." The crew exchanged looks of disbelief and determination. It was their only shot, and Rhodes knew they were running on borrowed time. "Then we'll make it count," Rhodes said. "Fire the remaining plasma charges directly at their reactor. Give them everything we've got." The bridge trembled as the Eclipse closed the gap, now within striking distance of the Carathar flagship. Turov, her hands steadied despite the chaos, hit the launch sequence. The plasma charges, the Eclipse's last remaining weapon, shot forward in perfect synchrony, their paths tracing a bright, deadly arc through the space between the two ships. The explosion that followed was nothing short of catastrophic. A brilliant flash of white light consumed the Carathar flagship. The shockwave reverberated through the Eclipse, sending the crew to their knees. The ship's systems screamed in protest, but it wasn't enough to stop them from witnessing the result. The Carathar flagship, once a towering symbol of the enemy's might, was no more. Its shattered remains drifted in the void, a smoking ruin of twisted metal and scorched hull. The remaining Carathar ships faltered, their unity fractured in an instant. Without their flagship, the fleet became disorganized, uncertain, and confused. Rhodes allowed himself a brief moment of victory. His plan had worked. But they weren't out of danger yet. The remaining Carathar ships quickly began to regroup, and Rhodes could feel the pressure mounting. They had taken down their leader, but the battle wasn't over. "Not yet." "Commander, get us out of here," he said, his voice low but steady. Voss nodded, but there was a note of hesitation in his response. "We don't have enough fuel for another jump, Captain. Not with the damage we've sustained." Rhodes' jaw clenched, but he didn't falter. "Then we'll fight our way out. All weapons, fire at will." Turov's fingers flew over her controls once more as the remaining plasma rounds tore into the closest Carathar ship, fragmenting it into pieces. The Eclipse danced through the chaos, dodging incoming fire and striking back with everything they had left. As the battle raged on, the crew of the Eclipse held their ground. Every shot, every evasive maneuver, brought them closer to freedom. Slowly, the Carathar fleet began to scatter, no longer organized, no longer a threat. But Rhodes knew that it wasn't just the weapons that won them this victory. It was their unity. Their refusal to bow under pressure. The Carathar had underestimated them, as they always did. They thought the humans would break, would surrender, would fall into despair. But they were wrong. The Eclipse had become the symbol of humanity's resilience, of their capacity to fight even when the odds were stacked against them. It wasn't about superior technology, or endless firepower. It was about something deeper, something the Carathar couldn't understand. Hope, determination, and the unshakable will to survive. With one final, devastating blast, the last of the Carathar ships exploded into a burst of debris. The silence that followed felt as deafening as the battle that had preceded it. Turov let out a long breath, her hand resting on the console. "We did it." Rhodes stood tall, his face expressionless as he watched the smoke clear from the debris field. "No," he said quietly. "We didn't just do it. We won." The crew of the Eclipse had done the impossible. They had taken down an enemy fleet, shattered a mighty force, and turned the tide in a war that had seemed lost. They had proven to the universe that humanity was not to be underestimated. Rhodes didn't need to say anything else. The victory was theirs, and it was enough. For now. The eclipse continued its slow drift through the stars, the vastness of space stretching before them, unknown and dangerous. But they were no longer afraid. They had learned that no matter the odds, no matter the challenge, they were ready to face whatever came next. Together.